My name is Major Ryan Carter. I'm 42 years old, and I spent 2 decades in the Army. I thought a simple family dinner would be easy. I thought a night at a beautiful restaurant would mean warmth and maybe, for once, a sense of belonging. Instead, the moment I walked through the doors of the Sterling Oak, I felt the air shift. It was the kind of shift you can't explain, but you feel deep in your chest. The host's smile faded when I said my name. He scanned the list and told me the Harrison party was already seated. I froze for a second. My wife Emily and her entire family were already at the table. No one had waited for me. The restaurant was one of those elegant places that smelled like money. Dim lights, velvet chairs, soft music that made people lower their voices. I wore my best jacket, not a uniform but something decent, something that made me look like I belonged. As I walked toward the table by the window, I saw them laughing like everything was perfect. Margaret, my mother-in-law, sat at the head like a queen, her pearls catching the light. Emily sat next to her, swirling her glass of wine, eyes fixed on the table. For a brief second, I almost convinced myself that this was just a misunderstanding. Then Margaret looked up and smiled. It wasn't warm, it was sharp. She raised her glass and let her voice carry just enough for the tables nearby to hear. She said she hadn't expected me to come. The words weren't cruel on their own, but the way she said them made it clear I wasn't supposed to be there. Emily didn't say a word. Her sisters looked down at their plates, trying to hide their smirks. I stood at the end of the table like a stranger who'd crashed a private party. Margaret leaned back, eyes traveling over me like I was something that had gone wrong with the decor. She mentioned how some places just aren't for everyone. She didn't have to say more. The table laughed softly. It was the kind of laugh that stings more than shouting. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't the first time she had thrown a jab, but this time it was in front of everyone, in public, at a table I had helped pay for. I looked at Emily. She kept her eyes on her wine glass, stirring it like she could disappear into it. I waited for her to speak. She didn't. I could hear silverware tapping plates, waiters moving in the background, someone popping a cork. Everything around me felt too normal while my world quietly tilted. I pulled the chair out and sat down, even though no one offered to make space. The laughter around me continued as if I wasn't even there. The waiter handed me a menu like it were an obligation. No one asked how my day was. No one cared. I thought of all the nights I'd faced things worse than this. Cold nights in the desert, sand in my boots, silence broken by gunfire. But those nights never made me feel small. This did. This was a different kind of war. Quiet, polished, dressed in pearls. I took a deep breath, kept my posture straight, and stared at the candle flickering in front of me. That was the moment it sank in. I was surrounded by people, yet completely alone at that table. For years, I let it slide. Every sideways comment, every fake smile, every dig disguised as advice. I told myself it was just her way and that it wasn't worth the fight. At our wedding, she hugged me and said I cleaned up better than she expected. I laughed along with her, like it was just a joke. Emily didn't say anything, and I convinced myself it wasn't the right moment to make it a thing. There was the Christmas when she handed out gifts and said mine was too hard to shop for since I wasn't really part of the family tradition yet. Then, the time at Emily's birthday when Margaret introduced me to her friend as the man who mixes a mean drink, not the man who had served his country. I smiled every time, let it roll off me like it didn't sting. I told myself peace was more important than pride, that being the bigger man meant not responding, but each time I let it go, it stayed with me. Quiet and steady, like a slow drip behind a wall. There were moments I thought she might soften. Times she'd ask about my deployments or thank me for something small, but it always turned. She once said I was brave for finding someone like Emily to marry. Brave, not lucky. As if she couldn't imagine someone like her daughter choosing someone like me on her own. Through it all, I never raised my voice. I held the door open, helped with dishes, and showed up to every family event. I gave respect, hoping it would be returned. It never was. But I stayed because I thought love meant staying, even when it hurt. I served 15 years in the Army, most of it overseas. I led a company through 2 deployments in Afghanistan, and not all of us came back. There were nights I stayed awake listening for mortar fire, days I walked point on roads we knew were seeded with IEDs, and the hours I spent writing letters for men who never got to send their own. I made decisions that saved lives and some that still haunt me. I never talked about those choices at the dinner table. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they wouldn't understand. To Margaret, I was just the guy who fixed the fence or grilled burgers in the backyard. To Emily's sisters, I was a quiet shadow in family photos. Nobody ever asked what it meant to be a leader in combat or what it cost to come home and still feel like I hadn't. Once, I pulled a wounded interpreter out of a burning vehicle. He lived. His family sent me a prayer blanket 2 months later. I folded it and kept it in the bottom of my footlocker, never once mentioning it. I didn't need applause or medals to mean something. I just wanted to live a life with integrity and purpose. But when I looked around that dinner table, I realized none of them saw that man. They saw a uniform and assumed they knew the story. Discipline, order, maybe a temper if the movies were right. But they never saw the nights I cried for the men I lost or the weight I carried when I walked into civilian life like nothing had changed. I never expected a parade, just a little respect. But sometimes, silence can scream louder than hate. The host stood there awkwardly, eyes darting between me and the table where Margaret sat, already half into her second glass of wine. I cleared my throat and asked if he could let Colonel Jim Walsh know that Ryan Carter was waiting out front. The name didn't register with the kid at first, but I saw him glance again at my face, like maybe I wasn't bluffing. He nodded and disappeared behind the double doors. Margaret chuckled under her breath and whispered something to Emily, who didn't even look up from her napkin. I stood still, hands in my pockets, calm. The room around me buzzed with low conversation and silverware clinks. But where I stood, the air was thick. My heart didn't race. It slowed, a strange kind of clarity, like I'd stepped outside the storm I'd been walking through for years. Then the doors swung open. Jim Walsh stepped out, still broad-shouldered despite the years, with that unmistakable military posture. His eyes scanned the lobby, and when they found me, his face lit up like sunrise. "Ryan Carter," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. He crossed the floor and pulled me into a hug that was part bear grip, part battlefield bond. That kind of embrace you don't fake. He stepped back, still holding my shoulders. "Look at you. Man, you clean up good." The host behind him looked stunned. I turned slightly so Margaret could see me clearly. Jim clapped my back again. "I told them you had an open invitation anytime." I smiled. "You built this place right, Colonel." He grinned. "Only because I had you in the design meetings. Your layout changed the way we use space. Still gets compliments." I saw it then. The shift. Margaret's smug look wavered, and Emily blinked like she was waking up. The sisters froze mid-sip. No one at that table had expected this. Jim turned to the host. "This man gets anything he wants. He's family." Margaret stood, tried to regain her footing with a half-hearted smile. Jim didn't even glance at her. I walked with him back toward the table. The staff scattered to add a place for me, like they were setting a seat for royalty. As I sat, Emily scooted to make room, eyes low. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but Jim cut her off, asking me if I'd looked at the wine list. He offered to uncork a bottle he'd been saving. One of the reserves from his retirement party. I nodded. That would be perfect. The waiter moved like he had been given orders from the top. Silverware reset, new glass, fresh napkin, all for the man who wasn't supposed to be there. I leaned back, looked around the table. For years, I'd been quiet. Tonight, I was done with quiet. Jim stood behind me as the wine was poured. When I consulted on this build, I told them to design the acoustics for both conversation and privacy. That's why no one in this place has to raise their voice to be heard. He paused and looked at Margaret. But sometimes it's good when the right people hear the right things. Margaret's smile faltered. Her hand gripped the stem of her glass just a bit too tightly. Emily looked like she wanted to vanish. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the truth settle in. They didn't know I was behind the layout of this restaurant, or that I'd helped Jim open 2 others before it. They didn't ask, because in their eyes, I'd never been more than the quiet guy at the end of the table. But now they had to see me, not just as Emily's husband, but as a man who had earned his seat before they even arrived. I cut a small piece of bread, laid it gently on my plate, took a sip of the wine. It was excellent. Jim nodded once more and returned to the back, but not before giving me one last look. That look between men who've seen things together, who doesn't need to speak to understand. The balance had shifted, not because I made a scene, but because I finally stopped hiding what I built. When I sat down, no one spoke. The same table that had buzzed with soft laughter now felt like it was holding its breath. Even the waiter moved more slowly, carefully, like the entire room sensed something had shifted. Margaret folded her napkin and placed it in her lap with robotic grace. Emily reached for her water, but her hand trembled just enough for the glass to clink against the plate. Her sisters kept their eyes low, pretending to study the menu, though none of them turned a page. I didn't rush. I took my time, buttered a piece of bread, and looked up only when the silence had fully settled in. It was strange how powerful quiet could be when you had nothing left to prove. I cleared my throat gently, and the sound felt louder than it should have. I asked Margaret how she liked the wine. She nodded too quickly, said it was lovely, but her voice cracked halfway through the word. I gave her a small smile. That bottle was one of the few I recommended when I helped build out Jim's cellar. He took my advice on everything, from the stone in the floor to the cut of the bar. Emily looked up, her eyes darting between me and her mother. She knew what was happening. I think part of her had always known, but knowing something and watching it unfold are 2 very different things. I leaned back, rested my hand on the table, fingers spread wide. There was a moment of stillness, and then I spoke again. I told them it was nice to finally eat here, after all the hours I'd spent on the design. The first time Jim showed me the architectural plans, I'd pointed out 3 flaws in 10 minutes. Margaret tried to laugh, said she had no idea. I looked at her and said, that's because I never made it about me. I always made it about what was best for the people around me. I turned to Emily's youngest sister and asked if her apartment still had heat. She blinked, nodded. I said good. The heating unit was replaced last winter. Quietly. Through a contact I had at the energy company, I didn't want her to know it came from me. I just wanted her to be warm. I looked at Emily next. Her voice caught in her throat before she could say anything. I told her I was proud of her studio. It was everything she dreamed of, and I meant that. Even if I paid for the lease up front and signed as the silent owner, no one touched their food. No one lifted a fork. I wasn't loud. I wasn't angry, but I had never felt more heard in my life. After dessert was served and barely touched, I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. No one said a word. I nodded once toward the table, stood up slowly, and walked out without looking back. The valet brought my truck around. I didn't rush. The evening air felt cool on my face, and for the first time in a long while, I felt light. At home, I moved through the house like a man who knew exactly where everything was and what no longer belonged to him. I packed 2 bags. Clothes, a photo of my parents, my old field journal, that was it. Emily came into the room halfway through. Her eyes were red, but she didn't speak. I looked at her and said I hoped she found what she was looking for. I didn't slam the door. I didn't take more than my share. I left the keys on the counter and walked out the same way I had lived in that house. Quietly, respectfully, almost invisible. But this time, I wasn't walking away to keep the peace. I was walking toward it. The calls started 2 days after I left. First from Emily, then her mother, then her sister. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't angry. I just didn't owe them my time anymore. The silence they gave me for years was now being returned. Within a week, Emily's boutique missed rent. The landlord called to ask if I still intended to sponsor the space. I told him I no longer had business with that account. The loan I'd co-signed for her brother's truck came due. He called me 4 times before I blocked the number. I didn't say a word. I just let the paperwork do what it does when signatures disappear. Margaret reached out to an old friend of mine on the city council. She wanted to know why her home improvement permit had been stalled. What she didn't know was that I'd helped push it through the first time. Quiet favors, done in good faith. That faith was gone, and now she sat waiting in a long line like everyone else. No shortcuts, no names to drop, just the reality of being ordinary again. The family began to unravel in small ways. Fewer gatherings, more tension. Emily posted old pictures online, maybe trying to rewrite what happened. I didn't comment. I didn't correct her. Let them believe what they needed to. The truth had already spoken. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with sirens or scenes. It comes with absence. And when people realize who was holding the pieces together all along, it's too late to ask them to stay. The new place is small, but it's mine. I wake up to quiet mornings, make my own coffee, and watch the sun hit the floorboards without wondering who's judging me from the other room. There's peace in the stillness. Sometimes I think back to the military. The routine, the weight, the pride. It shaped me, but it never owned me. I served with honor, and I carried that same quiet discipline into every part of my life after. What broke me wasn't war. It was unseen by the people I called family, being expected to shrink so others could feel tall. I gave everything I had, and in the end, I realized that wasn't love. That was silence dressed as loyalty. Leaving wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I just stopped lowering myself. Now I live without explaining who I am, without waiting for permission to matter. I don't need a room full of people to validate me. I define myself, and that, more than anything, is freedom.